Ira Magaziner, thank you so much for joining us in this series about market shaping, which MedAccess is doing. And you've been involved in this work longer than anyone else, so we'd love to hear the story about that, how that evolved. And I guess we'll just start with, you founded the Clinton Health Access Initiative in 2002. When you founded it, what were the issues you were trying to address?
Well, at that time, former President Clinton and I had been discussing what he was going to do in his post-presidency. And the question of AIDS was raging as there had been a triple therapy cure developed in the United States a few years earlier, but millions of people were dying every year in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, where the drugs were not available for people and the treatment system was not available. And the numbers were increasing, and it was a global crisis. And so we discussed, and I suggested that we try to confront the global AIDS crisis and see what we could do about it. And we went to attend the AIDS conference that year, Global AIDS Conference, which was being held in Barcelona, Spain. And during the conference, President Clinton was speaking, and also Nelson Mandela was speaking. And we went to meet Nelson after the speeches, and President Clinton said, I'm thinking, Ira and I were thinking of doing something about AIDS. And President Mandela looked at him and said, you promised me you were going to do something for Africa when you left office. This is what you have to do. And he looked at me and said, and Ira, you have to help him. So that was that. When Nelson Mandela told you you were going to do something, you did it. So we decided to set about it, and he asked me, President Clinton, to sort of map out what I thought we could do that would be effective. So I went to speak to a number of government leaders in Africa where AIDS was a significant problem. And there seemed to be two issues. There was a lot of strong will on the part of prime ministers and presidents in Africa and also in the Caribbean at the time to do something about AIDS, but they didn't know what to do. They didn't have the management systems. They didn't have the systems to organize logistics and training and so on and so forth. And the drugs and the tests were too high cost. They couldn't be afforded. And remember, this was before PEPFAR, before the Global Fund. There was some aid, bilateral aid, but not very much. So I wrote another President Clinton said, we have to do two things. First of all, we should partner with governments, because right now a lot of the work that's being done through aid is being done in parallel to governments. It's aid agencies and private nonprofit groups setting up their own sites for treatment or for testing. But really, it's the governments that run the health systems in the country. And if we're going to scale this, we have to partner with governments. And what they have told me they need most is help with management. It's just getting it organized and managed and setting up the systems to do the treatment. And then secondly, we need to do something about the affordability of the drugs. And here I had a background by then of many years as a business strategy consultant, first with the Boston Consulting Group, then with my own strategy consulting firm. And I had worked for a number of manufacturing companies, including drug companies and chemical companies and others, heavy industry. And I knew that there were tools that I had been involved in developing during that work, which could potentially be used in solving this problem. That the costs of the drugs and the tests, I thought, could be brought down dramatically, and therefore prices brought down dramatically if the right kind of approach was taken. So basically, that's what I suggested we do, is we try to work on bringing down the price of treatment, and secondly, we help governments set up the systems. So in 2002, we set up on the ground. We started in several countries, Mozambique, Rwanda, a couple of countries in the Caribbean, and so on. And we started partnering with the government. And I recruited a lot of people to work with us, initially all volunteers, but eventually we got donors and some paid people minimally. And I volunteered for 6 years. But we basically, the people I recruited, we recruited some people with medical backgrounds, but also people with business backgrounds. And I remember some of the traditional players in the AIDS field saying to me at the time, what are these business people doing here? They don't know anything about AIDS and so on. But I said, we have to solve the business problems here, the management problems, if we're going to succeed and help the governments. So we set about doing that. And then we started negotiations. And here's what's most relevant is that uh, when you look at the cost, and I may, at the risk of boring you to death here, go into a little bit of details because it's really fundamental to the success we've had now in over 150 deals that we've been involved in, which have dramatically lowered prices and increased availability of drugs, vaccines, medical devices, testing equipment, and so on. By 50 to 90%, we succeeded in lowering them and then continuing to lower them over time beyond that. And the key to it was to essentially do what we call dynamic cost analysis, which is what I'd helped pioneer back in my business strategy consulting days. And if you look at the cost of producing, let's say, a drug, first of all, there is a long supply chain. So there are different specialty chemicals or raw materials that are produced by different companies that then are put together into intermediate products. They're through chemical processes. And then they're put into what's called an active pharmaceutical ingredient, the actual ingredient that does the treatment. And that's often done by a separate company that buys all these specialty chemicals or raw materials and then produces the API. That API is then sold to the final producer of the drug, who is taking the API and adding what's called excipients or other things which basically stabilize the API, make it more palatable for people to take it, allow you to put it into tablet form or some other capsule form, and they put it into the tablets and capsules. And then you have to package it safely, especially if you're going into tropical environments to meet the heat and so on. And so you have packaging costs and so on. So you have this whole supply chain. And what you need to do is not look at what the costs are today for doing all of that for a company, because they're likely to be high, particularly for a new product that has relatively small volumes. But what you want to do is this dynamic cost analysis that we pioneered, which said, suppose I change certain conditions throughout the supply chain, what could I do at each step to actually lower costs? So the most obvious one is if I increase the overall volume that I'm buying, that allows you to reduce your costs in several ways. You can buy bigger machines that go faster. You can set up continuous processes instead of having to produce one step here and then manually take it to the next machine and then manually take the next machine. You can have enough volume to set up larger reactors and have it all flow automatically, which has certain advantages and so on and so forth. So overall volume can be important. Equally important can be the stability of ordering patterns every month. Because particularly in global health, what often happens is UNICEF or somebody else will do a big tender, and there'll be orders that spike and go up for certain products, but then they tail off for a while until the next tender and so on. And so if you're running a factory, your capacity utilization, your utilization of your facilities may go up to 98% fully utilized, then down to 60 and back up to 80. And meanwhile, you have all the extra costs because you don't fire the people and so on. And so you're having a lot of uncertainty. And when you have to place your orders with the specialty chemical people or the people supplying you the raw materials, you can only place short-term orders with them. And they also then have the problem of producing at small volumes and up and down and so on. There are also other things like specifications. So often, for example, the simplest one is packaging specifications. Now, this country wants description in French. This one wants it in English. This one wants certain things on the label. This one wants certain other things on the label. So basically, your labeling machines, you're constantly changing over from one type of label to another, small volumes, etc. Whereas if you get a bunch of countries to standardize the packaging requirements, put French and English and whatever on one label, you can cut costs dramatically in your packaging. And in all these cases, the final product producer can then place their orders in a more predictable manner, which allows the people supplying them to do things. So what we did, and I'll use the first example, when we did our first agreement in 2003 to lower the price of AIDS drugs. They were at about $5,000 per person per year in the developed world. There had been
This is the triple therapy.
Triple therapy.
$5,000
per person per year. The price in the developing world, certain companies had managed to lower to a $500 price, which began to make it affordable, but they could only offer that to certain people like Doctors Without Borders and so on. What we did was to negotiate a set of agreements that went from $500 to $139, and then ultimately down below $100 for the same drugs and so on. And we did it by bringing in people who were expert in dynamic cost analysis, signing non-disclosure agreements with the companies. And in 20 years of doing this, we were never accused of violating a non-disclosure. We sent in people that actually could help work with the manufacturing engineers and procurement people at each of the companies, and then go all the way back to their suppliers to try to understand how dynamically we could organize the market to allow them to lower their costs of production. So again, I'll talk about procurement traditionally in a minute, but basically, for example, if a given specialty chemical company that supplied a key ingredient needed to get 5 tons of orders in a predictable way in order to be set up a continuous process instead of just doing batches and having to clean out their machines because they were changing from one thing to another with different batches. But if they got to 5 tons a year, they could have a dedicated machine and set up a set of machines that worked in a continuous way. So for each ingredient, we went and talked to these suppliers and said, what do you need, to get your cost? And we're talking about major differences here. A difference between one specialty chemical company that we worked with recently on a ingredient for a malaria drug. It would cost them $400 a kilogram under today's conditions. If we could get them to that 5-ton level, it went down to $68. And if you multiply that by a whole series of different agreements, right, and ingredients that you need, we're able to sort of, at each step, cut the cost dramatically. And the net effect of it is that for the final product producer, they can produce at a much lower cost and still maintain their profit levels. And in fact, their return on investment can actually go up, because even though their return on sales may go down, that is, they're charging a lower price, they have less investment that they're making per unit that they're producing, so their return on investment can go up, and they're maintaining their profits, but yet prices have gone down in the market. So we managed to do that with 3 Indian companies, 1 South African company, who got WHO approval, so we knew they were good quality drugs. And we therefore managed to lower the prices dramatically. Once we had done that, and we were now turning our attention to the testing, there was CD4 tests, which we used to test for AIDS, and also viral load tests. The CD4 tests cost between $15 and $40. And at that point, the U.S. companies and European companies that we had, we had initially approached them on the drug side, but they didn't want to work with us. But then on the testing side, I remember the head of one of the companies saying to me, well, we don't want you to help Indian companies getting to compete with us, so we'll do the deal with you. And at that point, we then got U.S. and European companies to work with us on the testing. And on CD4, for example, the $15 to $40 price, we got down to $4 to $6 for the same exact, coming from the same exact U.S. suppliers and so on and so forth. And we would offer to work with any supplier who had a quality that was sufficient, and then see who we could work with. Okay. So That's what we've done now over and over again. And it made a major difference because it now became much more affordable. And the Global Fund in New Orleans had started up and PEPFAR had started up, and they could start purchasing now according to our agreements, which allowed them to purchase far, far more drugs for the same amount of money. And you set up a virtuous cycle where because the prices are lower, the volumes go up. Because the volumes go up, the costs become lower, and therefore the prices can go even lower. And as the market grows in total volume, other companies look to come into the market. So it doesn't kill the price or kill the business. If anything, it increases the business because you're increasing the volumes dramatically by treating millions more people who need the treatment. If you look traditionally at procurement philosophies, okay, that have existed, they often involved suppliers and buyers sitting across the table, hammering each other over profit levels. You know, how much profit? I want to get the price down. Well, I can't go to lower profit, and so on and so forth. And they miss the whole point of lowering cost, working together cooperatively to lower cost. You know, the buyer saying, okay, I'll standardize packaging with other buyers, or I'll give you a predictable order pattern for the next couple of years so that you can know every month you're going to get this many orders from me. And then you have other buyers doing the same thing. So you can say to a supplier, I've got 10 different buyers out there. You can be sure you're going to get this kind of volumes, so you can work with that, and so on and so forth. And I'll set specifications in a way that make it easier for you to manufacture in terms of the way in which I'm using my excipients or whatever. So they miss the whole idea of being able to cut costs. Then two other forms of procurement that were often used was one to say, okay, I'm going to do cost plus, right? And so they would send in accounting firms to a company, and the accounting firms say, yep, it costs them, $400 a kilogram to produce this. And so you'd add a profit on top of that, and then you'd buy. Again, that missed the whole idea of being able to reduce that 400. That was a static number based on very inefficient ways of producing. And you miss the whole idea of being able to lower those costs over time. And so what you did is locked in a higher cost. And if you look at the average production facility, the actual raw materials and direct labor are a fairly small part of the total. There are all kinds of indirect costs having to do with material handling, maintenance, utilities, yields. Do I have to throw away 20% of what I'm producing? Do I have to rework a certain percentage of what I'm producing? My inspection, my quality control, all that stuff. That's the stuff where there's a lot of flexibility. And as you take these steps to shape the market differently, you can reduce those indirects dramatically that make up most of the total cost. And you completely miss that if you just do a cost plus because you're doing what exists today, which is inefficient. And the other way people would procure is to say, okay, well, if I've got enough competitors, I run a tender, then the market competition will make sure my costs come down. Instead, what happens more often, though, is that companies are kind of signaling each other in the market by what they bid and how they tender and so on. And so what you'll normally find is that when you do those kinds of competitive tenders, there's not that much motivation to really cut costs. What happens is prices are roughly similar. And yes, if there's a company that's lower cost than another one, they make more profit. But you don't get the kind of dramatic price reductions we're able to get. What has to happen, and this is the key to market shaping, is this dynamic cost analysis done under NDA with multiple companies throughout the supply chain to help understand and negotiate. And then going back to the buyers and saying, look, if you buyers can do it this way, give them predictable monthly volumes, overall increase the volume, agree on certain specifications for the product so that they can use similar or the same suppliers of specialty chemicals, agree on packaging spec, we can get your price down 50 to 90%. And then what we would do to still maintain competition, and this is the last piece of it, is that we would work with any company who was willing to work with it. And then governments could still run their tenders, but they ran them under a price ceiling. So we, by negotiating with companies, we knew that they would agree and could make money under a certain price level because we had that visibility. And so we would say to the South African government or somebody else, run a tender, but say that the pricing cannot be more than X amount per dose or X amount per person per year or whatever, and then let them compete under that price ceiling. And what would tend to happen is that a company might win the first bid in a country at a certain price. Company B that didn't win that tender, when the next tender came around in another country, they were motivated to go a little bit lower and try to win that one. And so over time, as the tenders go and the volumes go, people look for a way to continually cut costs, and the prices continue to go down over time. So that probably tells you more than you needed to know, but that's the way we constructed. And then we started out with the AIDS drugs, an AIDS test. We had success with that, and then a number of people, Bill Gates and others, said, hey, can you do for malaria what you've done for AIDS? And so we moved into malaria, and then they said, how about TB? Can you work on TB? And then maternal and child health, and so on and so forth. So over time, we extended out into vaccines, into implantable contraceptives, into other things, and did similar work on each of those areas.
Ira, you told a story about some key decisions. One was you wanted to partner with governments, not just individual clinics or NGOs, but with governments, and that was because of scale and alignment with their plans.
And sustainability.
And at the same time, so you've got part of you working with governments. You also said, well, let's go work with these manufacturers, the people who are actually producing the stuff. And the key was looking at a dynamic understanding of cost reduction, but also the way the procurement systems affect how costs come out. And you also talked about raising volumes as one of the things that could happen in that. So my question is, why wasn't this happening already? I mean, why is it if you go talk to a manufacturer who produces medicines, why don't they automatically look for reducing their costs? It's an obvious way to raise their profits.
I think that most companies had a good market in the United States or elsewhere. And the idea of serving these developing countries was kind of a pain in the rear end to them. I mean, it was kind of, the markets are uncertain, the political environments are uncertain. And so they basically keyed their businesses to the developed world, where they already had established businesses, where they knew how to sell, where they could get higher prices and so on. And so it might be surprising, but many companies focus that way on price realization rather than on cost reduction. And so in many cases, some of the work that I had done during my business strategy consulting career was to work on the cost side of things, which was often a kind of secondary consideration for many companies. They're interested in new product innovation, they're interested in market development, and so on and so forth. So what we often found is that, and again, I'll use an example. We did a deal on rotavirus vaccine where we were working with GSK initially. They had a huge factory in Belgium where they produced. They got a $45 price per course for the rotavirus vaccine in Europe, US, etc. They had negotiated with the Pan American Health Organization to give a $15 price to the mainly middle-income countries in Latin America. And if you looked at the factory, what they did was a sort of average allocation of the overheads based upon direct labor. This is very typical in manufacturing companies. They will analyze the direct labor to produce something, and then they'll take all these overheads that I described, which might be 3 or 4 times as big as the direct labor. And they'll allocate them equally across and just say, okay, our overheads, we add, 300% to the direct labor, and that gives it. And they did that for all products going to all markets and so on. It's an average costing, we call it. So what we had to do is go in and work with the finance people and the manufacturing engineering people and say, well, wait a second. And this is typical of the kind of consulting assignment we might do in the private sector, right, for those companies. And we'd kind of joked, you're getting free consulting here because we're bringing people in who would have normally cost you a lot of money to hire to do this. And we would show them that they could reorganize things in a way that would allow them to have a more true realization of what these different overheads were costing them and how to trim these overheads. And the key to it was saying to them, we can add, right now you're selling, pick a number, 20 million courses this year. We can add 125 million to that if we sell into the developing world. Now let's look at what that can do, right? If it's predictable and if it's all the things I talked about before, standard product, etc. Here's then what that could do to your overhead costs, your indirect costs at your factory. And it's going to have 2 benefits for you. One is it will allow you to amortize those costs over a much bigger volume, including the R&D you put in and the capital investment you put in to build the factory. You're now going to have much bigger volumes that you have to amortize over it. So that's going to reduce your overall cost of those overheads in the factory. And you're going to keep your $45 price in the US and Europe. So in fact, you're going to make more money on that. And so you can afford to do a lower price in the developing countries to get all of that volume. We don't want you to lose money on that volume, but incrementally, you'll make less money, but it will all come out the same or better because you're making more money in developed countries, etc. So we did all that analysis with them, and they understood and saw that it would work. And so ultimately, we settled on a price that was around $5. I remember it was 45 in US, 15 in Paho 5. And then we had to solve another problem, which was that with the Pan American Health Organization, they had negotiated something which said they had what's called most favored nation status. That is, they had to have the lowest price in the world. And we couldn't afford to bring them down to $5, and they didn't need it because it was mostly middle-income countries. So we had to go back to Paho and said, look, you don't want us making a fuss around the world about how you're preventing Africa and other places from getting this vaccine. So we negotiated an agreement to get their 15 down to 12. And then we were able to get the price for Africa and so on to 5. And the company came out overall actually more profitable. And yet we now had $5 rotavirus vaccine that could go to 125 million people that needed it. So the key message here is that this kind of cost analysis, it differs product to product, situation to situation. In this case, you had one company pretty much supplying. But it involves the sort of detailed dynamic cost analysis. And the companies don't do it themselves because they have no motivation to, at the end of the day. It's not something they've focused much attention on.
I think my experience is also they often don't have the skills. Someone who's done this kind of dynamic cost analysis on many different companies can come in and say, oh, we will look at this.
That's true. And that's why, consulting firms like Boston Consulting Group, I came from, or others, have businesses because they can do exactly as you say. They go from company to company, can help them with this kind of work. And I think, the pioneering work we did on this back in the 1980s really was with companies like General Electric and others in a variety of different businesses where they understood the dynamic here. And part of what they were looking at was increasing international competition from Japan and elsewhere at the time. And we're looking to see how they could deal with that competition. So they brought us in to do the cost analysis and competitive cost analysis and to understand how they could become more competitive. But that's right. I mean, there is consulting firms that began to specialize in that kind of work.
How do you respond to the question about favoring some companies over others? Now, you've said, well, when you were running Chai, you'd be willing to work with any company that was willing to engage. But inevitably, you're helping some companies reduce their costs, get some market access, get first mover advantage. Aren't they then potentially in a place where they have a permanent advantage and therefore have an unfair advantage in the market?
So what we would do, and this important question, we would approach a universe of companies that had SRA approval, had approval from some regulatory body, could be EU, could be WHO, etc., that their quality was of a sufficient level. Before we would start a project, we will approach every company that has that SRA approval that produces that product. And we will offer to sign NDAs with them, and then we will offer to work with them in the same exact way on cost analysis. And so we give the opportunity to every company. There were some companies that don't have to do that, go away. Okay, that's your choice. Other companies would start to work with us, and it was clear that they were inevitably going to be high cost, others lower cost, and so on and so forth. And what we would do then is we would establish what was necessary for potential volume. And ultimately, in any market, the way it works is that the price becomes set at cost plus profit of the highest cost company necessary to fill the market, right? So if I'm a low cost guy and I've got a certain volume, let's say I can fill 40% of the market. Okay, there might be another guy who's 10% higher cost than me, but the market needs his volume. Another one that's 10% higher than that, but the market needs. So ultimately, the market price will sustain at the level initially of the person whose product is needed by the market, who has the highest costs, their cost book. Now, what happens over time once you set things in motion? We always say that competitive advantage is a leading position in a race, right? Because even if I am today sitting as the low-cost guy, and there are 4 or 5 other competitors out there, they're not going to stand still. I'm not going to stand still. I'm still doing more work to innovate, to cut costs. They are doing the same thing. There may be some new entrants that come in and say, hey, this looks attractive. They just sign big contracts now for increasing the volume here. So it becomes dynamic that way as well. People start to compete. I'll give you an example. When we brought dolutegravir into the market, it was a major drug that was vastly preferred by users of AIDS drugs, and improved upon less side effects, improved upon performance for people. And it started with just a couple of companies, 2 companies that were producing it. We negotiated with them. And once we got over the hump and the cost came down and so on, there were half dozen other companies that came in because they saw the opportunity. They saw that the big AIDS drug market, a lot of it was going to shift towards dolutegravir. And so they came along, and there were multiple suppliers. And virtually every deal we did, if you look 3, 4, 5 years later, there are more suppliers in the market than there were when we started, because the market took off and it's much bigger volume because the prices were lower and volumes were higher. So that's the way it tends to work. And from our point of view, one of the things required by governments of us and by groups like MedAccess and others is to say we can't pick winners and losers here. So the way we get around that is by giving everybody a chance. And then those that are most competitive will win in the beginning. But everybody has an equal chance.
So there's a lot of excitement about market shaping. Many organizations now involved in it, a lot of different people talking about, and for some organizations, it's all about bringing new innovations into the market and helping to drive technological change. For others, it's about large bulk procurements in large volumes. There are some of those who look for advanced market commitments to put out pots of money for particular product profiles. So there are a lot of different things going under the name of market shaping. And when you look at that universe and the focus that you've had on dynamic cost reduction and procurement, and what do you see as the strengths and weaknesses of those different tools and approaches?
Part of what I worry about here is that there's a name called market shaping, and a lot of people who are trying to do it don't fully understand what it requires. Some people are saying, well, we'll aggregate demand together so we can increase volume. We'll get a bunch of governments together and aggregate demand. That doesn't do it by itself, right? There are other people doing advanced market commitments, which solve part of the problem. We haven't talked about volume guarantees, but we should in a minute or two. And they'll say, we'll commit to take away the market risk for companies. That's important. That's an important piece. But on its own, it doesn't get the job done in terms of cost reduction because it doesn't set in motion the cost reduction changes that need to take place in order to support lower prices. It will produce some lowering of price, but not as much as is possible. So I think if there's anything that I want to try to communicate, it's that this is not a simple matter. This is that the dynamic cost analysis is at the core of this. And the ability to sign these NDAs, work with the companies, and set up the conditions all the way back through the supply chain, not just with the final supplier, so that you understand at each step in the process what needs to be done to lower costs for that step. And then you can put it all together. And that underpins then what you're able to do by way of making a volume guarantee or something else. The other thing I would say, volume guarantees were the other major piece in addition to dynamic cost analysis of what we introduced with the approach we developed at Chai. And the reason for that is that these are very capital-intensive industries that require a lot of investment. And companies are nervous about making those major investments without knowing that the market's really going to be there. And because of the way governments are funded, because of the way they do their tenders and so on and so forth, even the U.S. government, they can't make legal commitments beyond a certain amount of time in terms of procurement. So even though there might be, the government says, yeah, if you can produce at this price, and this specifications, I'll buy 1,000 of them. They won't sign a contract. They can't sign a contract. They can sort of say intent letter, maybe non-binding, so on. But if you're going to, build a new API factory and put, $500 million in the ground, non-binding maybes aren't enough. So the idea of having volume guarantees, where groups like MedAccess or the Gates Foundation have been the two biggest purveyors, can basically analyze the situation sufficiently, look at the dynamic cost analysis, look at the markets, look at the potential purchasers and who's serious and who isn't, and can provide a guarantee of that market risk. Was the other major piece of what allowed us to become successful, because that gave the confidence to companies to make those investments they needed to make, or to reorganize their relationships with suppliers in a way in which, dynamically we thought could be possible to lower costs. And so an advanced market commitment doesn't quite do that, because the guarantees are really linked together with the cost reduction and certain prices and so on. And an advanced market commitment on its own doesn't embody the cost reduction potential. So I think the establishment of the volume guarantee capability was, in a way, the partner of the dynamic cost reduction, and those two things together is what have enabled this all to happen.
So you mentioned that when you were at Chai, you did over 150 different agreements. But the great majority of those did not require volume guarantees to achieve the cost reduction, increased volumes. But some of these cases do require volume guarantees. And how do you know the difference about whether they're volume guarantees?
Some of the bigger ones do. It mainly comes down to when companies have to make major new investments, or often when there's a new technology coming to the market. A company will and should take the specification risk. That is to say, I can produce this product to this specification. That's their technology risk. And they should be able to say, I've analyzed this, maybe with help from China or whatever, and I think I can produce it at this cost. So they're taking the manufacturing risk and the technology risk. The market risk is the one they have most trouble with. And there are examples of this. I mean, power purchase agreements, for example, when you're building a new power plant, knowing that you've got a utility that will buy for 20 years and, became essential to getting new power plants built. And there are other examples. So I think the main difference is when there's significant investment required on the part of the companies to move forward and get to cost competitiveness or get the product developed to a full technology that meets specifications. Then the volume guarantee is often essential. And I don't know the exact number, but it's probably somewhere around 40 or 50, about, almost 1/3, 31% to 33% of the total deals we did involve volume guarantees. And they often tend to be the bigger deals because bigger investment, bigger deals, right? So.
You mentioned the electricity industry, other energy industries have had take or pay contracts for decades, but that had not been applied to global health in the same way. So part of the innovation was bringing that mindset into this as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the other thing is, the manufacturing dynamic cost analysis we had started to pioneer back in the 1980s, but it had not been brought to global health or to the nonprofit world at all, or even to government incentive world. And part of what informed me on this is that during my business consulting days, I also developed work that involved industrial policy for governments. And basically, traditionally, governments use macroeconomic tools to build their economies. But what we brought to some governments to say, look, in this new world of international competition, the traditional macroeconomic environment tools may not be sufficient. Because in a way, and Sweden was the first country we went to, and then we worked in Ireland, we worked in the UK, worked elsewhere. But in Sweden, for example, they had long had success as the world leader in shipbuilding, forestry, specialty steels, and so on. And what started to happen to them was they started getting competition from Korea in shipbuilding in Japan, from the Pacific Northwest in forestry, and from Brazil and iron ore, and from Japan and steel, and so on and so forth. And we said to them, let's look at the Swedish economy as a portfolio of, you'd look at a multi-product company. General Electric has many different businesses. Let's look at the Swedish economy as a collection of businesses and look at the competitive position globally and how it's changing in each of your businesses. Because the road they were going down was to try to offer government subsidies to those industries to help them stay competitive, or to set up protections or to stay competitive with the new entrants. And we did the analysis to say, look, it ain't going to work. The amount of money you'd have to put in to your shipbuilding industry to make it continuously competitive with what's going on in Korea, it's going to be too much. What you need to do is take advantage of the fact that you have a super educated workforce, you have tremendous engineering background to help pioneer industries of the future. And yes, you can do some special segments, like some of the specialty steels. You can get into the really specialized stuff. But your iron ore industry, which is a marvel. I mean, they mine iron ore almost a mile down underground north of the Arctic Circle in ways that are technologically fabulous. It's not going to be able to compete with tons of iron ore sitting on the surface of Australia in an area where you have, super tankers that can transport that iron ore anywhere. It's just not going to work. So anyway, coming back, the idea of taking incentives, if you will, and gearing them towards the future in an efficient way instead of just giving grants to kind of subsidize industries that aren't going to work anymore, to do things like volume guarantees or in some cases credit enhancements or other things, also informed what we were doing. And I tried to bring those over to say, here's what the global health community should be doing that could help stimulate the private investment and so on in a more effective way. Because ultimately, if MedAccess or Gates, if you were just to give a grant to somebody, to a company, let's say, to make an investment in one of these drugs, you give the grant, it's done, it's gone, right? If on the other hand, and you know this better than me, but if on the other hand you have a volume guarantee that's a lien against the balance sheet, then it does its job. It stimulates the investment to take place. And then you can roll it over into the next investment and the next one and the next one. And so it's a very efficient way to do philanthropy, more so than just giving grants. And the same thing with certain kinds of credit enhancements if they're done right, where if I'm an Indian company and I have to borrow 15%, 20% to build something or to finance my working capital, but I as a foundation can borrow at 5% or 6% or 7%, and I can help subsidize that interest rate differential with a loan. I get the loan paid back, the principal's paid back, I don't lose money, and I can roll it over to the next deal. And so that's what we tried to introduce, was that more effective. And I think given what's going on in the world today, being able to more effectively and efficiently use philanthropic funding in this way is going to become more and more important.
Well, I'm glad you came on to that. I was going to ask. You wrote a memo, I think in 2011, if memory serves correctly, which envisaged the creation of a fund for doing these kinds of volume guarantees and credit enhancements. That memo percolated through various channels, through the British government and elsewhere, and ultimately became what is now MedAccess, which I now lead. So we owe the founding of MedAccess to your original vision. If you were looking at the problem today in 2025 and asking the question of what should be done, would it be any different? Do you think we need different tools? Do we need different mindsets? Or is the problem largely similar?
I think similar tools could be very useful today, and in an expanded way. I think the other piece of it, which would be more necessary today, is that as governments in Africa and elsewhere would be more responsible for doing their own purchasing as opposed to USAID purchasing for them and so on and so forth. I think mechanisms that enable those governments to set up national health insurance systems of various sorts, and some countries have started to do this, which in a income diversified way, wealthier people pay more and poorer people paying less, but nevertheless having national systems that become solvent. And they could also then be leveraged for certain kinds of borrowing or certain kinds of philanthropy as an underpinning to be able to then allow a country to do its own purchasing, I think is one thing which could do a lot more today. And it would become a potentially a ring-fenced, not something that could be where governments could decide, okay, I'm going to take the money I was raising for, my health insurance and spend it on defense this year. It would have to be something ring-fenced, much as national health insurance systems are in many countries, or private health insurance. So I think something like that would be useful, combined with the other tools that we talked about before, with the ability to use the funds more efficiently. And I also think that where possible, helping establish local industry that can be competitive. But I think that the main point I'm trying to make is that the local manufacturing, the attracting local manufacturing that could be competitive globally and then eventually export is important too. And I think we're going to have to see more of that in developing countries, and I think it's possible. But the key there, and I can't emphasize this enough, is you can't just put an uncompetitive factory in Africa and say, okay, I'm going to have local production, because people will not pay the higher prices. So basically, you have to make sure that when you're setting these things up, that they can be globally cost competitive over time. But I think that will also help when you have local production of these.
Having some dynamic cost analysis and looking very carefully at the costs of production and also with the sales.
Making sure it can be competitive, exactly, yeah.
Yes. Ira Magaziner, thank you so much for giving us your time today, and thank you for all the work that you've done to create this field and to establish MedAccess. Very grateful.
Thank you. Thank you very much.